Oh, good evening, welcome. What a joy to have such a full room for such an important book. I would like to begin celebrating our freedom to publish books, buy books, disagree about books. You all saw the news today from East Jerusalem, where two of perhaps the most important booksellers on this planet have been imprisoned. They've been released today, but they're under house arrest and they can't return to their books for 20 days. So buy books while we can and support publishers and booksellers, please. Omar, the first thing I want to say to you is thank you. This book goes straight onto the special shelf with Sven Lindqvist and John Berger and Solnit and Baldwin and the books that made me.
Do you have a worse shelf you could put it on? I can't. If at all possible, like I'm not...
I sometimes put books out front and say, help yourself. I could do that if you want.
Yeah. It's a lot of pressure, man. Thank you.
It's really an extraordinary book and we need it. And I know so many people, it's spreading like a sort of virus of positivity among our community. So thank you. I really mean it from the bottom of my heart. I want to start, if it's okay, with, I suppose, chronologically for you, with journalism. And I want you to speak a little bit about where we are. I mean, today particularly feels like we are every day at the moment, but today feels we are sort of through another looking glass. My messages in my phone every morning are like searching for vocabulary, searching for expletives, searching for some way to express how utterly insane things feel. That may be because the symptoms of the hijacking of the media space, or the coup, as Carol Cadwallader is calling it, of data, of information is so great. But it may also just be that we are unable to process the horror. And this is what this book is about. But can you speak first from the journalistic point of view of writing in a post-truth space, particularly from a Western oppositional space with a mainstream narrative that has been so thoroughly hijacked?
Thank you very much for doing this, first of all. I really, really appreciate it, and thank you for all the work you've been doing. It means the world. Thank you all for coming out to this. To give you a sense of what my average crowd size normally is, I did an event in Tampa once where 2.5 people showed up. 2 were an elderly couple who came over and said, we don't know you or anything about your work, but we saw that you're Egyptian. Our son-in-law is Egyptian. His name's Mohammed. And then there was a pause because they expected me to be like, oh, Mohammed of the Hampton Mohammeds. And I had to break it to them that there are quite a few of us. And the third guy was there on the wrong night. He was supposed to show up for a different author, but he couldn't leave because 33% of the crowd would have left the room with him. So this is not something I take for granted, and I'm very grateful for it. Thank you. I got into journalism, it almost coincided directly with the sort of start of the War on Terror years. And I think a little bit of how that plays out in the day-to-day mechanics of it, where you have journalists who, by and large, are trying their best. You collect information, you digest the information, you are in the business of finding out what the hell is happening. And then it passes through a machine that has to deal with so many external pressures that whatever started over here may well become something quite grotesque on the other side of it. We don't generally in journalism have a very good institutional mechanism for dealing with an outright lie, with bad faith. The model of the journalist as this very neutral observer, as the referee, as the scorekeeper, works perfectly well in a mode where people are operating in bad faith. You take the claim, you take the counterclaim, you put them on there, you let the reader decide. But you know, I live in a country where one of the most powerful lawmakers once mused about whether wildfires are caused by Jewish space lasers. Yeah. Here's the claim. I've now got an expert from UCLA to talk about how that's probably not true. I mean, it's nonsense, right? It's patently deranged. But journalism as something that stands in direct opposition to a lie is a model that's much harder than journalism that simply presents to you that, you think the moon is made out of cheese and I don't. Here you go. The central question that I think a lot of journalists should be asking themselves at all times, but particularly over the last year and a half where we have seen some of the most egregious, horrific, and permissive, I suppose, violations of the craft, is the story that you would write in a vacuum, absent any external pressure, and the story that you write in the real world with those external pressures. How different are those two stories? That is something you need to ask yourself, I think, as a journalist all of the time, but particularly in situations where you are helping present a framework that could be a launching point for getting people killed. And I think that's a very difficult thing to do. And I've seen my old newspaper, and I've seen plenty of media outlets fail quite spectacularly in both those regards.
If we accept that the outright lie is, as a gesture and as a political act, a poisoning of the communal waters of the body politic, as it were, that we are all part of and work within, what are one's options as an individual, separate from the capitalist structures of the newspapers and the distribution of information, online or in print? What are the options emotionally for a journalist pushing against that tide? And is that one of the reasons why this book exists? Because this can't be done in a column. It can't be done week in, week out as a kind of act of resistance using, where language itself has become a kind of futile, degraded terrain.
Yeah, I mean, it's extremely limited, right? Because you're dealing with something of a kind of complexity that I think a lot of the media apparatus is quite simply not designed to carry out into the world. And language here, I think, is a particularly sort of central part of all of this. There's a part in this book that is about the time I spent covering the military trials in Guantanamo Bay. And that is a place where I got a crash course, an education in the derangement of language and the use of language for the exact opposite of what language should be used for, the use of language for the unmaking of meaning. We're walking around one of the prison camps, and I ask a question of one of the soldiers. I say, so when do the prisoners, and I'm immediately stopped, and he says, "We have no prisoners here, sir, we have detainees." And he was fully invested in that, right? Because that's part of the enterprise that he's in, and he needs to... A prisoner implies a prison sentence, which somebody has to define. Even a life sentence, at some point, somebody has to define. A detainee you can hold forever. There were no interrogations at Guantanamo Bay. Of course, people were interrogated left, right, and center. They just did not call it that. They called it a reservation. Detainee 8652 has an 8:30 p.m. reservation. It meant they were going to be taken to the interrogation sheds. This is the infrastructure that kind of holds that up. And how the hell do you try to dismantle that within the context of an article? When I got to Afghanistan, one of the first days I was in the NATO airfield, and it became very clear that the guards who were guarding the outer wire, where all the attacks happened, because that's the interface with the outside world, were all Afghanistani troops. 18-year-old kids, no training, the weapons the Soviets left behind, the inner wire guarded by the NATO troops. There was a hierarchy of the value of life, and all of these people are supposed to be on the same team. It's a difficult thing to try and engage with within the context of a machine that was never really built to tackle that kind of thing. So my roundabout answer is that it's extremely limited, and very few of us are lucky enough to be able to sort of try to tackle that in the course of a book. And even then, I don't know if I did that at all, but it was one of the things I was thinking about, because you have a little space to sort of expand on it.
And you have to be relatively tactical. It's a bit like the military-industrial complex, which is one of my preoccupations, is, They don't call it a missile, they call it a highly developed, they don't call it the arms trade, they call it tech, they call it defense, machinery and tech, and one drives oneself and one's immediate audience mad by attempting to deconstruct that language relentlessly. In terms of the value of life then, let's take your prompt and go to this question, which is, I suppose, at the heart of this book, of how we value one life higher than another. And actually sticking with journalism to some extent because of the deliberate murder of journalists in the Gaza Strip over the last 16 months. Would you speak a little bit about not only your solidarity with those people and your grief for those people, but how that is a new terrain, a new rupture, a new atrocity by design in a war which is simultaneously an information war, but also has gone beyond what the moral compass of the world had previously allowed in terms of military strategy. Will you speak a little bit, without having to kind of paraphrase the more heartbroken and angry aspects of this book, about what that has meant for you personally as a journalist, before we get on to what it's meant to you as a person with brown skin, or as a person from a certain place in the world, or as an American citizen? Congratulations, by the way. I'm really, really happy for you. Great timing.
Yeah.
But would you speak a little bit about the murder of your colleagues, the deliberate hunting of your colleagues in Palestine in the last 16 months?
Yeah. The only practical effect of getting a U.S. citizenship in my case, because I got it for very pragmatic reasons, right? I'm just going to get through the border easier, et cetera, et cetera. And then a couple of months after I got it, I was nominated for this thing in Canada called the Giller Prize. I eventually end up winning the Giller Prize, which comes with a $100,000 check. Canada doesn't tax prize money. The U.S. does. The only practical effect has been me having to pay $30,000 to the U.S. government. That is very much neither here nor there. There's going to come a time when, despite the best efforts of the settler colonial state, the empire, the entire apparatus that is responsible for this mass killing, will no longer just be able to keep as much of a lid on what happened in this place. And I keep thinking about that, and I keep thinking about the articles that are going to be written about the extent of this nightmare and the extent of the slaughter, and how we live in a part of the world where it's deeply, deeply necessary that the person who ends up writing that article not look like me, right? Because then it'll be a milestone. Then it won't be the Hamas run anything, and it won't be Palestinian whoever says, and all of these incredibly degrading terms that are applied to the people who, as far as I'm concerned, have been doing the single most important acts of journalism on this earth, and have been paying with their lives for it. And it's frustrating on so many angles, and frustrating is such a silly word to use because we're sitting here in this room where I'm not all that worried that a missile is going to land on our heads or that our entire bloodlines are going to be raised. So how frustrated can I really get? I'm on the launching side of the missiles, but these are the people who are doing the work that in a contextual vacuum, every journalist would say they want to do, right? You're doing the most important journalism, stories that if you didn't hear about them from me, you wouldn't have heard about them. I spent a while as a tech reporter. I did goddamn Apple iPhone launches. If you didn't hear about the new iPhone from me, you would have heard about it from 200 other journalists, right? They're doing the single most important journalism, and we still have this ticking clock to, well, let's wait till the white people get there, and then we'll get those articles, and then we will get some sense of the public record. And so it's extremely frustrating on that front. And then it's extremely frustrating on the front you mentioned, which is this notion of, here's another norm that's been destroyed, right? When I was out in Afghanistan, we used to have these conversations about whether it was better to wear the same flak vests that the soldiers were wearing, or whether it was better to wear that blue one. And all of these arguments were predicated on the idea that there were rules related to this, right? That's been obliterated. That's gone now, like the bombing of hospitals and like a million other things. And then finally, in a very overarching way, I killed those people, right? That's me. That's my tax money. That's the 30 grand I paid, and as part of that Giller thing. That's me. I'm doing that. And so not only am I not in a position of solidarity with these people, I am part of the machine, right? And it's been extremely frustrating to watch these agencies that are supposed to be concerned with press freedom and the protection of journalists just suddenly get real sluggish, you know, just suddenly take their sweet time to really think over whether the killing of journalists is that bad a thing. I'm on the board of one of these organizations. We haven't met in like 2 years. What are we doing here, you know? But it's, I mean, it seems to me to be sort of very much intertwined with the default framing that has been around for much, much longer than the last 2 years of this nightmare, which is that there exists a certain group of people who act as a kind of moral steam vent. They just don't count. And what happens to them is contained within that. Well, first of all, it's not contained, right? Any more than the armored vehicles that I saw in a war zone ended up being part of the police departments in the United States. You think those drones that are sniping kids are going to remain in this part? But even if that was the case, that doesn't make it any less evil, right? And so for all those reasons, you're watching this and it just feels like so much of what I thought was load-bearing in an institutional sense quite simply isn't.
And if you were to get analytical about how and why, as you do in this book, how and why that's been possible within the moral mechanics of the individual, beyond easy labels such as, well, it's the function of white supremacy, or it's an examined or unexamined racism on the part of individuals that become communities, that become institutions. How do you, in terms of this red line, or as David Lammy said about our arms sale in this country, there is no red line, and what Anthony Lowenstein has been so brilliant about revealing the extent to which, as you say, the technology being used in Palestine is a testing ground for the way that technology will be used else in the world. To what extent does the world catch up with that? Is it a process of denial, or is it simply the laboratory of mass murder always has a lag, but the lag is only impacted on the conscience of the West latterly, as you say, when white journalists go in, or when it affects white people. How do you account for that at an emotional level? Because it's a form of insanity, isn't it? It's a total abandonment of sanity, of the functioning of the human consciousness in relation to another. It's a derangement, as I think you say. How do we? I'm not suggesting we find a vocabulary for that is condemnatory, because that's easy. But how do we deal with the implications of that as those new forms of killing, as those new forms of disregard, as those new forms of technical ingenuity as regards mass murder become commonplace? What does it mean? I mean, we're going to get to this, I hope, or I sort of don't hope, but what does it mean for any parent anywhere in the world that we have designed and tested that machinery for killing children, and live streamed it and watched it on our phones and said nothing? I'm asking you an impossible question, but I hope I'm asking you more nicely than some journalists that you're going to meet. I'm asking you with the opportunity for you to say, I don't fucking know.
Oh shit, I had that option from the start? God, I mean, you just told me before I started writing the, no, I'm, you know, the book starts, or early on in the book, I talk about this scene from my childhood when I grew up in Qatar. I realize now I don't have the sort of cultural knowledge base to know. When I do this in North America, the next 5 minutes are spent with me explaining what Qatar is and where it is. And for some reason, I feel I don't need to do that here. But that's more a statement on the U.S. than anything else. But we were driving around. We were like, you know, I was 16. My friend was 17, 18, and there was a Southeast Asian man had bumped into the back of a Qatari guy's car, and the Qatari guy had come out and was just enraged. It was a slight fender bender. It did not matter. And he takes off his sandal and starts hitting this guy, and there's like, And people are like cheering in the streets and like honking. We lived in a place, and I'm sure many places are like this, but in a place like Qatar, it's quite overt, where there's a real racial hierarchy, right? And at the bottom of that hierarchy are the laborers, what they call the third country laborers, who have built the entire place, without whom most of modern Qatar would not exist, and who are treated horrifically, right?
Well, we saw this because the slave labor that built the World Cup was deemed utterly expendable.
Right, yeah.
Human life
I think it
value
was an average of one died a day building those things. And the reason I bring this up is because I didn't think twice about this, right? We're passing this, and I bought in fully to that. That was the narrative framework that was presented to me. And for all of my life in Qatar, and for many years afterwards, until I sort of unlearned that, that was just the way it is, right? There's a hierarchy. Whose life has more value, who gets the privileges of being considered fully human. It's very difficult for me to sort of issue indictments of anyone else when I've seen how easily that comes to everyone, myself included. There's sort of, sometimes I find myself, because I've been oriented in the direction of the West since a very young age, I find myself trying to shed impulses to make someone give a shit that are very much from within that context. And what I mean by that is, something like the pagers, the exploding pagers, right? How many liberals did I see issue some kind of condemnation that came in the form of, what if one of these guys was on a plane? Or like, now every cell phone, your own cell phone could be used. Sure, that is absolutely true, but like that little girl who got her face blown off is enough, right? And so I find that I have a real trouble resisting the impulse that has been sort of honed into me to try and condemn a very present, very current, very ongoing horror in terms of some speculative future where it might affect people who actually matter, as opposed to the very real past and the very real present in which it has happened and is currently happening. Yeah, maybe the exact type of sniper drone that is active right now in Palestine will come here one day. But the damage that looking away from this is doing to your soul is happening right now. You want an indicator of how this is going to happen? Take a look at the muscles you are exercising by being deliberately oblivious of these things that are happening right now to people just as human as you are.
You talk about, I want to stay on that in a little bit. You talk about a thing called institutional gutlessness, which we might apply to the Fourth Estate, we might apply to our literary communities, we might apply to any number of institutions. Do you think you are armed because of your movement between the place of your birth, the place of your upbringing, and the place where you are settled and now have citizenship and have a child and so on and so forth? Do you think you're armed with a kind of empathic maneuverability that simply isn't available to citizens that are born and stay in a place, and that is just simply one of the functions of the globalized world? Are you asking a great deal of people in order to care? I always feel this with the kind of mechanics of, I think about it a lot in relation to the charity sector and the kind of cliches of, people will care more if you show them a photograph of a dead child. Evidently not the case. As you say, people go to the White House and show pictures of dead children all the time, expecting it to affect the economic machinery of genocide, and it doesn't. But do you think that you have you're gifted a kind of viewpoint that is, works well for a journalist, and I think as a fiction writer as well? Would you speak a little bit about the displaced or the those on the move being armed with a kind of superpower in that regard? That one can, it's a bit like people only support a charity when it affects someone that they love, or people are better able to understand the pain of others if some clever thought experiment is done. Like you see those things all the time that are like, 20,000 dead in New York. Made you look, it's Lebanon. The way that we are now required to trick one another. What I think I most profoundly loved about your book is its absence of trickery. you are not doing a sort of thought experiment in your reader whereby you might surprise them into caring. There's a kind of, for want of a better word, Canadian straightforwardness.
I'm trying to think of what the sentence is going to end with now. I cannot begin to imagine.
Straightforwardness, like a kind of lack of affect. There's no, like a lack of gamesmanship, if you like, which I think the gamesmanship for me is connected at a stylistic level to a sort of superiority on the author's part. Let me reveal to you how you have been. You're simply saying what you see and saying it as straightforwardly as you can in a way. There's a lack of, it's a beautifully written book, but there's a lack of literary style because of the severity of your message. Do you think that comes from your, as it were, your limbo between cultural or even literary trainings or forms?
That's really interesting.
Anecdotally to tell you this,
please.
I was recently traveling in the Middle East with Egyptians, right?
Why? Why would you do that?
It's a terrible misunderstanding.
Yeah, okay.
But what Middle Eastern people say about Egyptians all the time is, you're so funny. This has something to do with the history of soap opera, I think, in Egypt. But anyway, I'm sure they wouldn't mind me saying this. Maybe they're even here in the room. They're not especially funny people. Like, they're amazing, but they're not like laugh-a-minute comedians. But even little children were like, "Oh, you're Egyptian. Tell us a joke." And they're like, "No." But this is what I'm asking about: this sort of sensibility that you've potentially inherited, and then you've learned with your journalistic trade, and then you've relearned to write fiction, and then you've questioned because you've moved and grown up in another environment, and then you've severely questioned because, are we the baddies? I live in America. What is the Western empire do to my voice? So I guess I'm asking you to slightly diagnose your own stylistic and literary decisions.
Yeah. I do this thing when I get nervous, and I'm nervous a lot of the time. Tonight I'm shaking because I'm cold. I promise you that's what it is. But I do this very, very unadvisable thing where I try to make jokes, and it's the worst. I was on the phone with the head of PR, the spokesperson for the State Department, because I had to get security clearance to go to Gitmo. They have to do the security check, and there was a lull in the conversation, and because I'm very scared, I can't let the lull go on too long, and I said something like, "So I bet I'm the first guy named Omar who's going to Gitmo willingly, huh?" Just tumbleweeds, just crickets. And then I got a very stern, like, there's journalists from all over the world, including from many Arab countries. The worst one was actually here in London 2 books ago. I was doing an interview with a podcaster, and he gave me this thing that I think most immigrants in the room will have some familiarity with, which was, "Oh, you speak English so well," and you sort of. I was like, "Man, it's a vulture language. You can learn this in a weekend. It's fine." But I decided to, I made this joke. I said, actually, I write the books in Arabic and then I run them through Google Translate. And he believed me. And the rest of the interview, there was no going back from that point. We just had to roll with it for the rest of the... So how funny or unfunny we are, I'm not sure, but deadpan doesn't work for us so hot.
Maybe it's just a fatal combination.
Yeah.
The legendary Egyptian humor meets a very dry Canadian.
There's a
You're just foxing the algorithm. It's
like the Egyptian thing is I think there's a particular kind of sense of humor, a fairly dark one that you develop when your own government keeps trying to destroy you but fails. Just doesn't quite get it right. Yeah, I mean, I don't think I've developed any more talent for empathy than any other human being, but this aspect or this quality or whatever of having been a guest on someone else's land since I was 5 years old, I think puts me in a place where certain narrative constructions as they relate to the nation state, as they relate to entities that I might be patriotic about, simply don't exist for me. And they find their way into my writing to get at this notion of, diagnosing my own literary style. You pick up the first novel, and the first thing you see is a map where I've sunk the eastern seaboard of the United States underwater, and I gave the Southwest back to Mexico. And the second novel takes place on the eastern coast of Crete, but all the flora and the fauna is made up. And it's more of a negation, I think, than anything else, is this notion of by virtue of the kind of life I've had, I have very little respect for the idea that there is something inherently sacred about the idea of the nation state. And it may well be the case that if I was born in Egypt, raised in Egypt, and never left Egypt, that I would disavow everything I just told you, and I hold the exact opposite views. But this is a function of the kind of life I've had. And so one of the things, there are many things I find baffling, but one of the things I find especially baffling is this idea that I must have a kind of overarching allegiance that colors the rest of all of this. And I quite simply don't. And I've never fully understood this idea of countering the argument that it's a bad thing to slaughter tens of thousands of kids with an appeal to the nation state. It's actually, I think, far from a talent. It's actually, I think, a weakness. I shouldn't be finding those things baffling. I think I should have more familiarity with it, but this is what happens when you leave at 5 and you move ever since.
I want to therefore ask you about this question of why more people are not upset by the industrial slaughter of so many innocent people, so many children in particular. And you write really beautifully in the book, from what I would say, this is what I'm trying to get at, I think, in asking you about your literary style, from what I would say is because people will say, congratulations, you're so fearless, or you're so brave in writing that. And I don't think you'd accept those compliments. You don't presumably feel you've been particularly fearless or particularly brave. But in the current environment, it certainly comes across as such, because you have stated quite clearly your bafflement at a human level, irrespective of your origins or your current identity or citizenship. A deep, incalculable wretchedness of the human spirit, a hurt that you feel that this is normalized, encouraged, paid for, celebrated, etc. But also, from an American point of view, profoundly connected to a post 9/11 or a post formation of the American empire based on the dead bodies of Native Americans, whatever post, however far we date it back in the history of colonialism and white supremacy. A disavowal of peaceful means of cohabiting on this planet. We have discredited peace in such a profound way that the most common response to writing about the stopping of killing is just an easy belittlement, a mockery. This sense that you'll grow up. When I bang on about the arms trade, people often say, oh, get over it or grow up. That to be non-violent or to propagate non-violent ideas is to be infantile or naive, as if the absolute modus operandi, be-all and end-all of human progress in an industrial world must be highly sophisticated means of death visited upon those most vulnerable. And that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, that the richest man on earth puts all his energy into stopping the hungriest people on earth getting food, or that the most powerful man on earth makes it his hobby, his apparently flippant masturbatory fantasy to murder the people most in need of his aid. How do you, I'm asking on behalf of all of us, and I know you don't have an easy answer, how do you not go mad? How do you not scream? How do we look our children in the eye and convey to them that is the norm, and that they too will be belittled if they seek a more refined or generous or empathetic attitude towards their fellow human beings?
I have.
And what is, sorry, and just to add to maybe help you with an answer, what is it about the characteristic of the usually male, usually political or industrial character that does that disdainful, you'll grow up? How have we arrived at that man in a suit, usually using kind of vague language about what he does for a living, when what he does for a living is design the machinery or means by which people are killed?
It's strange because there's two facets to that question, and one of them, I've been struggling with both of them, but one of them I have absolutely no answer for. This notion of how I would explain it to my kids, for example, or how I would, the part about the sort of perceived naivete of grow up. This is serious business here, and
you woke, you hippie, you lefty.
That whole aspect of it, I think, to me anyway, relates or brings up two ideas, right? The first is that the overarching systems under which many of us live, settler colonialism, whatever stage of capitalism this is, are by their nature sort of insatiable. There's an endless kind of taking. And so in that sense, it is actually an incredibly dangerous thing to present a worldview that doesn't normalize the endless taking as something that simply has to exist above all other concerns, or else the entire machine comes to a stop. And that's an honest point of view. I don't need to agree with it, but that's, if you believe in these systems, then you must to some extent believe that there's nothing more important than Amazon's third quarter earnings this year being higher than their third quarter earnings last year, right? And so the insatiability, I think, is built into the system. But also, I think we have done a fantastically, terrifyingly good job at conflating convenience and betterment, which is to say, my Amazon package used to take 3 days, now it takes 2 days, therefore things must be getting better. And you see the sort of after effects of this across the board, right? Every protest back in the US, I don't know what it's like here, but every time there's a protest, you know, they're marching on a bridge in Brooklyn or what, there's always sort of an institutional response of, hey, don't you know you're keeping people from getting to work? Yeah. You're delaying. No, you're not helping your cause, says somebody who hates your cause and from whom you should never take advice about your cause. But again, it makes perfect sense if you conflate convenience and betterment. The only way things get better is if they get more convenient. But that does sort of present a mode of counterattack. Because once you know that you can make appeals to convenience, it's terrifying that this is the way to get people to change or to give a damn about anything, but it's there as a kind of avenue, right? So that's the way I think about this notion, which I think you're absolutely correct about how easy it is to sort of dismiss a concern that should, in any kind of rational mode of being, supersede everything else. Hey, I don't want to see kids get killed. It's not, you know. The other side of that question, though, the closest I can come to is to say that as cynical as I've become about all of the institutional sort of load-bearing beams of this part of the world, of the West in general, I have become so inspired by what people are doing at an individual level and a community level and building that fabric of solidarity. I mean, out where I live, you got kids at Ivy League schools who have been handed the golden key, right? You're in now. You're in, here it is. You don't have to worry about this. And they've decided to hand it back in the form of protest. And I think that is one of the reasons why the response to that at the administrative level has been so brutal and so cruel. I think it's because there is a sense of betrayal. We let you in. We let you be a part of this.
And now you're throwing soup at our Van Goghs?
Yeah, exactly, right? And it's enraging, right? You were...
At a sort of Freudian level, right? It's a kind of if the kind of muscular Christianity / capitalist structure, which is a caved animal, which is now a wounded beast, how dare you take this privilege that's been handed to you and give it back to me?
And I mean, I've experienced the other variant of that personally to a very small extent, and I don't want to sort of overplay it, but the number of times over the last year and a half where I've received a particularly vitriolic response from somebody with whom I used to be close and realized, oh my God, I was one of your good ones. You know, you looked at me and you were like, you're one of the good, and then I betrayed that, you know. Again, there's an element of it being personal because the entire system is based on some kind of reward-punishment equilibrium. And at least from my point of view, I'm watching it fall apart. I mean, not that long ago, a guy shoots dead the CEO of a health insurance company. Generally speaking, murder is not a thing that we all kind of celebrate, right? And then you see this reaction and you see it sort of predicated on the idea that this company and this industry with which this man is involved has been responsible for so many deaths in the name of profit that there is a kind of steam vent kind of component, right? But the biggest distinction I've seen in terms of response, particularly to the slaughter in Gaza, but also climate change and also institutional injustice across the board, has not been ideological. It's not been along ethnic grounds or religious grounds. The biggest distinction has been generational. I mean, when I was writing this book and I would talk to people older than me, the prevailing response was, hey, you probably shouldn't write that book, you know. There was something that person had learned to normalize over the years that they were not going to unnormalize now. It was too late. And when I talk to people younger than me, this is the quaintest, tamest thing, right? And part of that is because the reward-punishment structure is kind of falling apart, right? The whole point was turn your head away from this stuff over here, and you don't even have to get your hands dirty. Someone else will take care of that. And in exchange, you know, there's the house and the two-car garage and a better life than your parents had. And a lot of the younger folks I talk to don't believe that any of that is in place anymore. And so once your reward-punishment structure falls apart in a society that is so dependent on both to keep people in line, I don't know what's going to happen from here. But I have a very hard time believing that the systems as they exist today are going to be able to survive it.
I agree. And I love the way that towards in the final pages of your book, you speak of individuals doing extraordinary gestures into this. And it's not hope as the formulation of necessarily smashing down the door in any kind of ideological sense. It is literally the carrying of materials, the standing on a street. Can I ask you if we're going to get into the specifics of what you think will happen? Because you've written a book, so now you're an expert, so now you have to answer these difficult questions.
Sure, go for it.
I want to speak, obviously Trump's and Smotrich's comments this morning are hugely alarming in their kind of brazenness and the callousness and the implications from a human rights point of view about the ethnic cleansing of Gaza and the West Bank particularly, but also a certain callousness about geopolitical matters more generally. You know, there's a kind of infantile recklessness going on. Many people I speak to in the Arab world say, and as many Israeli historians on the left have said for a while, what we are looking at simply is the fall of the American empire, and with it falls the flow of arms and the sustainability of the annexing of the occupied territories and so on and so forth. That seems too hopeful to me, given the structures that dominate our time. But I'm also I want hope, you know, and some of the ways that you avoid any kind of pat formulations of hope at the end of the book, but point to a kind of deeper, longer, more individual reckoning that we all have to do, which may take the form of unfriending. I love the way you say quite cleanly, there are people that I cared about that I no longer would do. We're all doing it. It's happening to us all. There are people for whom I've lost respect. That's okay. Like a kind of new landscape, both emotionally and politically for us all. Would you speak specifically to the occupied territories and what you think will happen in the next few months? If there is a hopeful scenario, a reordering of Arab solidarity, so on and so forth, I want to ask you that as a political opinion. But then if I could ask you to take that also in an emotional direction, in terms of a sense of futility and despair that many people feel at the moment, what are our opportunities for at least, if not any pat formulations of hope, at least putting one foot in front of the other, whether it's being on the street, whether it's signing petitions, whether it's boycotts, whether it's screaming, whether it's aid, whatever it is. And I know they're kind of interconnected and unanswerable again, but it seems to be your speciality to give really good answers to unanswerable conundrums.
I'm an expert in absolutely nothing, and there are things that I have a sense of certainty about, but they're very, very few. One of the things that I have a sense of certainty about is that Palestine will be free, and beyond that, that it will teach so many people how to be free. This is not a population that is not well versed in resistance and in survival. I wake up a lot of days fully dejected, and useless to almost anybody. And I say that in the context of having suffered nothing, relatively speaking, nothing. But I do think of I was on this Zoom panel for a climate anthology once, and I go back to this a lot because the final question was something like, where's hope? Where do you get hope? And everybody gave some kind of canned answer of one kind or another, except the last guy whose house had burned down in the California wildfires. And he said, there is no hope. We've let things get too bad. There's no hope, but we must behave as though there is. And so I try to carry that with me. You do the work because you're obligated to do the work. In my case, I have young children, and I don't know that there's anything quite as cowardly as conceding on someone else's behalf. But I fully believe that it will take years to come to terms with how this moment has broken me and the ways in which it has broken me. I mean, we need to be able to grieve, right? This isn't just some number that's arbitrarily going up. And these are human beings, right? And I don't know about you, but like I haven't had that grief. I haven't been able to because you wake up every day and you think, okay, what are we going to do? What's it? And that's of course important, but like we're human beings. My sense is, and this is maybe an incredibly optimistic, it might be a simultaneously optimistic and depressing take, but last year for the first time, I think, as far as I can recall, looking away from the suffering of Palestinians had an effect on the domestic politics of the most powerful nation on earth, right? A guy who could have possibly been vice president or presidential candidate was passed over because of comments he made about protesters who were protesting against the genocide. And of course, a presidential candidate lost to one of the most deranged human beings ever to run for president. And it's impossible not to think that that the position, the Democratic Party's position on Palestine played a part in that, right? These feel like such minor things because we're talking about a genocide and it should play more than a minor part. But it happened and you could see it. And granted, all those strategists probably kept their jobs and maybe next cycle Bill Clinton will go to Michigan again to tell Arabs how great this all is, and fine. But you start to see consequences in the heart of the empire, right? And I get it when an Arab guy says consequences in the heart of the empire. People are like, oh my God, he's radicalized, it's going to be blow up in the Super Bowl or whatever. I'm talking about things that previously people in positions of power did not have to consider as factors suddenly becoming factors. Coupled with, of course, the almost lightness of how Donald Trump doesn't bother to wear the mask. If you assess the politicians by the chasm between the performance and the reality, that gap is much, much closer for a man like him. And so my sense is, because the self-preservation instinct is such a central part of political life, particularly in a place like the United States, that finally having faced some consequences, the party that might be, or at least one would think is in a better position to give a shit and do something, might do that down the line. But man, that's a lot of dead people. And that's a lot of time, and that's a lot of futility. But again, you wake up every day and you call your congressperson, even though they do not give a shit. If you can get enough people to call their congresspeople, then they have a little log, and they get, there was 50 calls today, we need to pay attention. And you just do that work, and a big chunk of the work is simply getting out of bed in the morning and believing that this is going to matter.
And it's no coincidence, of course, that our exemplars in this, I'm someone that would just, I'm like a full-time heartbroken woke hippie, so I would like lie around crying all day if I could. I think I met in the West Bank last year the human being who I would consider to be the opposite of Trump. if there's an opposite in almost every possible way, physical behavior, mannerisms, affectations, hair, eyes, skin, body, clothing, everything, this dude was the light if Trump is the dark. And he had had his home demolished. And we sat in a temporary terrapin on what had been his home, and he'd already received the demolition order for that second temporary home. And you get a bill with the demolition order. So he's got to pay $27,000 to have his first home demolished, sorry. And then he's got a new bill to pay for the demolition of his temporary home. And this is actually, hey, you'll love this, because you're Egyptian and you find things funny.
Amazing.
He said, because we're British and we completely lost our sense of humor about 250 years ago when we broke the world, because it was not funny. He said two things. One was, they can't take us from this land. And I will sleep underneath that tree if I have to, because I belong here, as my parents and my grandparents and my great-great-grandparents belonged here. And then he said, do me one favor when you go home. Tell everybody one thing. And we were like, we needed a job to do, so we were like, yes, please, anything. And he went, tell everyone how beautiful my wife is. And his wife, who'd obviously heard that joke like 1,000 times, was like... It is incredibly important to open to the audience for questions, because there will be some. There are roving mics. Georgia, our host this evening, is wearing a bright pink shirt, but there's a couple of other well-dressed dudes with mics. So please raise your hand, wait for the mic because it's being live streamed, and also wait for me to indicate you. And usual stuff about trying to keep it. Omar's time is precious, so we want questions. Okay, go for it.
Is that me? Thank you. Thank you both for the wisdom in your words and all the heart behind them. But as you speak, above us is a circle for the chief execs of BNP Paribas. They are the largest financier of arms to Israel, worth about 5.7 billion. So my question to both of you is, how do you suggest we bridge the moral abyss above the floorboards?
Can you just repeat the first sentence? I missed the details.
Above us right now is a circle of the chief execs for BNP Paribas, the French bank, who are one of the largest funders for arms to Israel. How do we bridge the moral abyss between this floor and the one above? Thank you.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Omar.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that. Up in Canada, this thing, the Giller Prize, is by far the biggest literary prize in the country, and it's funded by Scotiabank. Scotiabank is, I think, the largest, or at one time was the largest foreign investor in Elbit Systems, the Israeli weapons maker. And in the fall of 2023, a group of activists had started to, well, they'd been working on agitating for the Giller Prize to cut ties with Scotiabank, or with Scotiabank to divest from Elbit Systems. And this eventually became a campaign that involved several writers, myself included. I didn't do very much on it. I did the bare minimum. I signed some open letters. I gave some interviews. But it was instructive because the way that worked was such that there was a narrative of working together and we'll find a common solution, and that sort of, open dialogue. And then somebody did the math, and all of a sudden it changed to you're all raging anti-Semites and you're targeting this prize because there's a Jewish family involved, and it became deeply, deeply antagonistic almost overnight. And several of the folks involved decided to back away because it's sort of career ruining now to be seen in that light. And then we kept agitating, and then about a couple of weeks ago, the prize finally announced that it's cutting ties with the bank. Now, I should say that I take zero credit for that. I did not. There's activists who had their homes raided and risked arrest and were arrested, and the charges were dropped at the last minute, and their livelihoods were affected. And the reason I bring all of this up is simply to say that the work you are describing is, to me, if not at the top, very near the top of what we need to do, which is to suffocate the finance of an industry of mass murder. But we have to go into that with our eyes open, because this is such an acute, an important load-bearing beam of the entire system. Now we're talking about money, right? The pushback is going to be particularly harsh. And there are people whose lives effectively have been ruined because they pushed for this. I have no good answer to your question. I only say that in my very limited experience of trying to bridge the moral abyss, it is by far the most important thing we can do, and it is also, as a result, going to cost a lot. And you have to be willing to walk away from a level of comfort and privilege and lack of antagonism that you won't see in many other areas of advocacy.
That's the best answer I've heard to that question, and that we've all been asked a lot of. We might not get our free glass of wine in the yurt at the book tent anymore because we agitated a little bit about the sponsorship. I don't give a fuck, I'll buy my own wine. Thank you for that answer.
Sorry, I'll just add one thing very quickly. Like, it's everywhere. It's everywhere. And once you begin to sort of try to answer that question instead of just sort of look away from it, it's all around you, right? Like, this book's on Amazon. What's Amazon's investment? Like, everything. And so I think, at least if you're anything like me, you might have moments of severe doubt in the sense of, well, I'm just a walking hypocrite now, right? Because I didn't do this or I didn't do that or so on and so forth. But, you agitate for cleaner quality air and yet you still breathe the air. How dare you, sort of thing. I think you do well to remember that it's all hypocrisy all of the time. And within even that system, every little thing you do still matters.
Thank you.
We've got one right back here.
Hello. Hi, Omar and Max. Thank you for this evening. I work with Al Jazeera. Omar, you probably already know this, but if Jazeera had an internal bestsellers list, your book would be at the top. It's being spoken about a lot within the channel, and we're all very touched by it. So thank you for that. My question is a little self-indulgent. I'm doing it largely because I think you speak and write so well, despite all the pain. What did you make of the pictures, the footage of Palestinians walking back to the north of Gaza? I was in Doha when that happened. We were in the newsroom. It was very affecting for many of us. How did you find it? Did you feel hopeful? Or were you nervous that they will all go back and then Israel will start all over again? What was your sentiment?
Thank you for that. That was very generous of you. I appreciate it. Earlier when we were talking, I said that I'm certain about very few things, but that one of the things I'm certain about is that Palestinians will be free and that they will act as a model of what freedom actually means. And so, you see those pictures and you realize that there's something incredibly powerful here, right? There's the power of weaponry, and there's the power of propaganda, and there's the power of immense resources enacted against a people who not only have none of those resources, but also don't have narrative cover to justify any mode of violence. And it's incredibly asymmetric. But there are multiple arenas of engagement. The arena of engagement, the arena of violence is incredibly asymmetric. The state holds all the cards, not just in terms of weaponry, but in terms of justification for using violence. But the arena of joy is asymmetric in the other direction, right? The arena of caring so much about the place you're rooted to that you will happily walk back into rubble. And I'm sorry, I shouldn't use the word happily, but there was happiness there. This is evident, I think. That arena is asymmetric in the other direction. And there's a reason that there's all these stories that come out about Palestinians being released from administrative detention or whatever the hell they call it, and being ordered not to show too much joy when they reunite with their family. You know, I'm a giant coward in the sense that I sit here and tell you that I'm a huge pacifist and that I abhor violence in all its forms, and I might believe that. But based on where my tax dollars are going, I'm one of the most violent human beings on earth, right? But I do firmly think that the arena of violence is the one in which the asymmetry is most in favor of the state. And when I saw those images, I was reminded that there are other arenas of engagement. And within those, it's like waking up again and realizing that yes, the joy will win and the rootedness will win. I firmly believe that. So that was my initial reaction to it.
Am I being given the power to point? This gentleman has his hand up.
Hello. Hi. Thanks for your talk. It's really informative. We hear the phrase Free Palestine all the time, or I hear it all the time. And when I've tried to engage people who say Free Palestine on what that actually means, you know, what is the solution, a lot of the time I'm given a very wishy-washy answer, such as, oh, well, you know, it's not for us to kind of dictate to the people of the region how they resolve their problems. But at the same time, I don't think it does justice to Palestinians or Israelis to give a wishy-washy answer to that and try to evade defining what Palestinian freedom is. So without trying to evade it, what do you mean by that? What does Palestinian freedom look like to you? And particularly in the context of national borders, you can't really get away from that. Does it mean Israel returning to 1967 borders, 1948 borders, two-state solution, or indeed the dissolution of the State of Israel? Because Free Palestine can mean any one of those things. That's my question.
Thank you for that. Do you want to jump or should I?
I have an answer, but go for it. It's your book event.
Let's both do it. Thank you for that. I appreciate it. I think that there is currently and has been for a very long time an open-air prison called Gaza. I would imagine a solution would involve dismantling a situation in which a population lives under a perpetual state of occupation, in which a state where Palestinians are deemed second-class citizens and have to drive on different roads and use different buses, is remedied along the axis of how it would be remedied in any other part of the world. I think one of the reasons that people give wishy-washy answers to that question is A, in my case, we're not political scientists. We see an act of injustice and we want to do something about it. But B, because wishy-washy answers to that question have been a fundamental part of the Western response to this occupation. We can talk about a one-state solution or a two-state solution. There have been surveys done asking Palestinians and Israelis whether they would like a two-state solution or a one-state solution. And in many cases, the majority opinion is the same, a one-state solution, except that when the Palestinians respond, it's a one-state solution in which everybody has equal rights. And when the Israelis respond, the predominant opinion is that it's a one-state solution in which Palestinians do not have those rights. The one thing I want to address is this notion that, you know, when you say Free Palestine, that it could mean anything leading up to the eradication of Israel and Israelis, and I don't know what somebody's thinking when they say Free Palestine, and quite frankly, I don't care, especially when I'm seeing a campaign of actual eradication happening. But I think the narrative framing in which there's a set of answers that will solve this immediately is quite frustrating to me. Palestinians deserve to be free. They had their land stolen from them and their homes stolen from them. And so the right of return functions into this, and the right to have a state of your own, and the right not to be ruled over by a state that considers you subhuman. That would be a central part of my answer. But I do reject this imaginative poverty, I think, that kicks in, where within the settler colonial construct, you're either stepping on the neck or you're having your neck stepped on. And so suddenly the statement of free Palestine must mean an incitement to genocide. Yeah, sure. If you're not stepping on the neck, you're having the neck stepped on. Beyond that, I can't give you an answer that would fly in the UN. I apologize.
Oh, sorry. I thought you were saying you had one. Do we have any other questions? Yep. Omar said more or less what I would say. I think I think that it's very interesting to, I recently heard Avi Shlaim speak, and I thought he spoke really incredibly beautifully about the question of the mid-90s moment where, post-Oslo Accords, where the question of a two-state solution had a great deal of traction in the West, which disappeared. A lot of Palestinians today, and maybe people on the left in Israel, will speak of a one-state solution with equal rights. That seems to me to be the correct kind of language. Equal rights. The second word that would come to mind if I think of any forward movement in a geopolitical level about Palestinian people would be justice. Because you cannot have the level of injustice, particularly in relation to the genocide, but also to the settler project. It is illegal. So you have to have a think about the right of return and justice being done. Quite separate from national identity and certainly separate from religious identity, because we have to have a shared moral and legalistic framework for how to cohabit this planet. These are all things that predate the genocide, which puts us into a completely separate place. None of us are free until Palestine is free, because it is the great convergence of all the fault lines, political, religious fault lines in the world. So it's not a question we can avoid, and nor is it the reason I kind of agree with Omar about the idea of a wishy-washy answer. It's because the volatility and the seriousness and the symbolic magnitude of the question is such that people are terrified. You get in more trouble, as you say in your book, for protesting for human rights for a certain type of people than you do for causing a grave act of violence against them. So we're into a topsy-turvy place. That creates wishy-washy answers and moral uncertainty. I would bow to the wisdom of Palestinians both on the land and in the diaspora about this, but there are declarations of Palestinian statehood around the world, some of which I think are profoundly brave in as much as they focus on justice more than revenge. And it will fall to the Palestinian people to formalize the balance of those two things. And they will be the world will learn from them in that regard, I think. As Omar said, Palestinians will be free, and their freedom will be a lesson to the world, I hope. There was a hand there.
Thank you very much for this very good talk. A lot of what was covered is about the West facing itself and its principles in light of what has happened in Gaza. But what has not been talked about, and I would love to get your opinion, is what about the rest of the world, the non-Western states? Some of them been very vocal in terms of the way they look at this, and it's really at odds with the way the West has approached this issue. Some of them have taken very active steps to make their voice heard. And maybe to address the previous question, if I'm not mistaken, I think about 90% of the state of the world, representing about 80% of the world population, recognize Israel and Palestine in the 1967 border. It just so happened that the West is outside of this consensus. So if it is about the West recognizing, maybe having a social moral reckoning, to which extent the voice of the rest can have a role to play in that?
Thank you for that. I spent a month last fall teaching back in Qatar. Georgetown has a campus there. A few years ago, the Qatari royal family went to North America and just handed out blank checks. And it was like, come build a campus. So there's a bunch of campuses in Doha. And it's an incredibly important campus in terms of, it's probably one of the main reasons Saudi Arabia doesn't jump over the border every now and then, because attacking a U.S. school is entirely different proposition. There's a military base on the outskirts of Qatar, on the outskirts of Doha, that is a massive U.S. military base. And I think if the Qatari royal family decided that they weren't going to have that there anymore, I think the following day probably Saudi Arabia would invade, because they would get a phone call. The reason I bring all of this up is because I agree completely in the sense that within what we like to call the global south, or I forget what the terminology is for the rest of us, I suppose, there's an immense kind of rage, right? Precisely because you see time and time again in quite literally hundreds of UN resolutions an overwhelming majority standing in opposition of what is very obviously an illegal occupation, and yet you see in a pragmatic manner, when it comes to the actual doing of things, a very small group of states that is essentially holding the contradictory opinion and getting their way because might is right, I suppose. But one of the layers that I think is maybe under-examined is that the rage is exacerbated by the fact that the governments of these countries, in many cases, are put in a position where they're either paying protection money to the United States or in some way hindered from doing what their people desire because of the relationship with power. And so you get a rage that is directed outward and inward at the same time. Certainly this is true of the place where I was born, and of many places around the world. I'm not sure that the 3 or 4 tiny island nations that seem to vote against Palestine on every UN resolution are that invested in the issue. I doubt it. Probably there's an aid package somewhere that is kind of dependent on this. And so to me, it seems like a bit of a ticking clock, right? How long can you contain the rage of a people because of a pragmatic political arrangement that to you might be existential as the leader of this place or as the administrator or the government of this place? But surely the bubbling rage of your own people is also inevitably an existential thing. I don't know how it ends, but it's certainly a fault line that I think has come to define much of how the world operates.
And that fault line, as you say, is more visible now in the era of Trump because the mask is off. There's one more question, and then is it okay to ask you to just read a short section of the book to finish? You don't hate reading? All right, cool. Last question from the front here, and then a quick reading.
Before I ask a question of you, Omar, I wanted to say thank you both for this event. When I asked you, Max, whether you'd do this conversation with Omar, I had high expectations because of knowing you and how you felt about many of the themes and subjects and ideas that Omar's exploring, that we would be given this opportunity to hear a really nuanced and beautiful and I think deep conversation about complicated matters. And in a way, your answers have kind of echoed how I feel about you as a writer and what you've done on the page. And you know, I run this publishing house, Canongate, and have done for 30 years, and I can say hand on heart, this is the most important book we've ever published at Canongate, and that's not something I say lightly, not least because of respect for a lot of other writers we published who I love and think have written great books too.
No, they suck. You've said it. You're on record. They're all terrible.
Yeah,
There's a load of really pissed off people at the back there, Jamie. Jeff Dyer's here!
I do genuinely mean that. But I also think it's one of the most important books I've read. I'd put it up with anything I've read. But I wanted to talk to you about, it's interesting you're about to read something from the book, so it connects with that. I read your book a couple of times, and then last week I listened to your reading of it, and it affected me even more than the first two readings of it on the page. And I don't know whether that's because the third time it was just getting deeper into challenging me in even more ways and upsetting me more, but also inspiring me more because of what you do on the line. But I wanted to ask you what the reading experience was like, going back to this book you'd written and then going into a studio and reading it, because you added a whole other dimension. And I hope everyone in this room buys this book, not because I'm your publisher and I think they will go, but because I think the book is so important. But I would also urge people in this room to listen to Omar's reading of it, because it is magnificent and it takes the book to another level. And I just wanted to ask you, in my very long-winded way of asking a question, how was that experience of reading? Because it must have been intense.
Thank you for that. One of the things about working with Jamie in Canongate is either he's the most enthusiastic publisher on the face of the planet, or all my previous publishers have hated my work. I'm not 100% sure what it is. I'm in a state of severe self-doubt ever since I've come to know you. At a certain point, Penguin Random House came over and said, you need to read the audiobook because we're not putting these words in anybody else's mouth. We're not going to subject our usual readers to this. And so I went to a sound studio in Portland, and I had previously done a podcast which absolutely no human being has ever listened to, but it came with, you know, a lot of voice work, obviously. And at all times during the making of this podcast, my producers would constantly say, hey, could you pep it up a little bit? Like, could we get a little bit more? And I would say, no. I mean, have you met me? That's not what you get. That's not the deal here. And then I went into the sound studio and they said, your tone is perfect for this content. This is exactly what we need. But it's a very strange experience, and I have immense respect for people who do this, who do the audiobook reading, because it made me realize how much I half-ass everything in my life. You know, I go to the gym and the bench press is hard, so my reps are, you know, I cut corners, and you can't do that stuff when you have two professional sound engineers in your ear listening to every word and saying, nope, do it again, do it again, do it again. But the reading of it, I think, was you know, there were a couple of places where I broke down and everybody had to kind of, you know, pause and you can sort of, you can hear them, you can see them talking to each other through the one-way glass, but they put me on mute, so clearly I can tell that I'm being talked about, you know, or something like that. But it was, that was the more cathartic experience, weirdly enough, than the writing. The writing, obviously, you're in the middle of it, but to sit there and read it. And look, I can't, you know, I'm not going to do the anti-Jamie, but I can't tell you it's a good book. I can't tell you to buy it. I can't tell you any of these things. I'm not in a position to assess my own writing. I've never been in my life. But it was the only thing I was able to write. I don't know what the hell this work we do is. If in this moment, you know, we call ourselves writers, that means you're engaged with the human condition and what it means to be human, and to then turn away and to look down and to wait so that I can write the beautiful novel 20 years from now, when it just felt, this felt like just short of doing absolutely nothing. And now I'm going to read from it. What do you want me to read?
This is very rude of me to ask to choose a section. I'd like you to read, please, from I'm Reminded of What Susan Sontag. Wouldn't it be hilarious if he's like, I'm reminded of what the writer Susan Sontag.
I've never seen this text before. The problem is when you run it through Google Translate from the original Arabic, is that it really... that's called a callback in the business, for those of you who are... all right, let's do this. I'm reminded of what Susan Sontag is supposed to have said about the great lesson of the Second World War, that 10% of people are fundamentally good, 10 are fundamentally evil, and the other 80 swayable in either direction. But I don't know if I agree. There are young people all over the West risking expulsion and defamation, risking their livelihoods, their entire careers, to protest the killing. There are Jews being arrested on the streets of Frankfurt, blocking Grand Central Station in New York, fighting for peace. There are indigenous communities who have suffered the Western world's most unspeakable atrocities and still find the will to stand up for an occupied land on the other side of the planet, who recognize a thing for what it is. I think instead of Virginia Woolf's conversation with that lawyer over the images of the war's dead. I cannot argue with you, cannot convince you of anything, because when you and I look at these pictures, we see, fundamentally, different things.
Would you read the last bit? No, just, yeah, because this is where I needed a little walk.
In the final moments of Aaron Bushnell's life, officers rushed to the site of his burning. One asks for a fire extinguisher. Another points his guns at the flames.
Omar El Akkad, thank you so much.